Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about how Nitin Gadkari's ethanol policy could harm India. Over the last year or so, one of the most ambitious energy policies promoted by India's government has been the expansion of ethanol-blended fuel. Among the strongest advocates of the policy has been Nitin Gadkari, one of India's most influential ministers. Gadkari has repeatedly argued that ethanol can reduce India's dependence on imported crude oil, increase farmers' incomes, create rural employment, and contribute to a cleaner environment. These goals sound attractive. India imports a large share of its oil, farmers often struggle with unstable incomes, and pollution remains a major challenge. On paper, ethanol appears to offer a solution to several problems at once. However, a growing number of economists, environmental experts, automotive engineers, consumer groups, and opposition politicians argue that the ethanol program may creating new problems while attempting to solve the old ones. The debate has become particularly intense following the nationwide expansion of E20 fuel, which contains 20% ethanol and 80% petrol. Critics argue that the policy has been implemented too quickly, places an unfair burden on consumers, threatens food security, increases pressure on water resources, and may benefit certain industries more than ordinary citizens. One of the biggest criticisms of the ethanol program is its impact on vehicle owners. Ethanol contains less energy than petrol. This means that when ethanol is blended into fuel, vehicles generally travel few kilometers per liter compared with pure petrol. Government studies and industry assessments have acknowledged that E20 fuel can result in a reduction in mileage, although officials describe the decline as relatively small. Nevertheless, even a modest decrease became significant with multiplied across millions of vehicles and billions of liters of fuel consumed every year. Critics argue that consumers are effectively paying similar fuel prices while receiving less distance from every tank. For ordinary Indians already struggling with inflation, this issue is not merely technical. A commuter who drives hundreds of kilometers every month may find that lower fuel efficiency increases monthly transportation costs. Small business owners, taxi operators, delivery workers, and gig economy drivers may experience a direct financial impact. Critics therefore argue that the ethanol policy transfers some of the cost of energy transition onto ordinary citizens rather than distributing them more evenly throughout society. Another major concern involves vehicle compatibility. While modern vehicles are increasingly designed to accommodate higher ethanol blends, millions of older vehicles on Indian roads were originally engineered for fuels with lower ethanol content. Automotive experts and manufacturers have warned that older engines may face increased wear, corrosion risks, deterioration of rubber components, and other maintenance issues when exposed to higher ethanol concentrations over long periods. Some manufacturers have even warned that using fuel blends beyond approved limit could affect warranty coverage for older vehicles. Critics argue that consumers who purchased vehicle under one set of assumptions are now being forced to adapt to a new fuel environment without adequate choice. Supporters of the ethanol policy respond that E20 has undergone extensive testing and that many fears are exaggerated. Government officials have repeatedly rejected claims that E20 causes widespread engine damage. However, critics argue that even if catastrophic damage is uncommon, questions about long-term durability, maintenance costs, and consumer choice remain unresolved. The controversy itself demonstrates that public confidence in the policy is far from universal. Perhaps the most serious criticism relates to water. Ethanol production in India relies heavily on crops such as sugarcane, rice, and maize. Sugarcane, in particular, is among the most water-intensive crops cultivated in the country. Environmental experts have long warned that expanding ethanol production through sugarcane cultivation may worsen groundwater depletion and increase pressure on already stressed water systems. This concern is especially significant in regions that frequently experience drought conditions. Critics argue that using scarce freshwater resources to produce fuel is difficult to justify in a country where millions of people continues to face water shortages. The water issue becomes even more troubling when viewed through the lens of climate change. Rising temperatures, unpredictable monsoons, and increasing drought frequency are expected to place additional pressure in India's water resources in the coming decades. Under these conditions, critics argue that expanding a fuel program dependent on water intensive feedstocks could prove environmentally unsustainable. Food security is another area of concern. Ethanol does not emerge from thin air, it triggers agricultural feedstocks that could otherwise be used for food production. As ethanol demand rises, farmers may find it more profitable to cultivate crops destined for fuel production rather than food markets. Critics fear that this shift may reduce the availability of essential food crops and contribute to higher food prices. Several analysts have warned that increased diversion of maize, rice, and other agricultural products toward ethanol production may distort agricultural priorities and undermine long-term food security. The economic survey's observations regarding changing crops pattern have intensified these concerns. Rising incentives for ethanol feedstocks may encourage farmers to move away from pulse and oil seeds, potentially increasing India's dependence on imports for essential food commodities. Critics argue that replacing one form of import dependence, crude oil, with another form of import dependence, like food products, does not necessarily strengthen national security. Instead, it may simply shift the problem from one sector to another. Supporters often defend ethanol by emphasizing energy security. India imports most of its crude oil, making the country vulnerable to international price shocks and geopolitical disruptions. Ethanol blending can reduce crude oil imports and generate savings. Yet critics argue that the picture is more complicated. Producing ethanol at large scale requires fertilizers, irrigation, electricity, transportation, infrastructure, and other inputs. Some of these inputs themselves depend on imports. Therefore, the reduction in crude oil dependence may be partially offset by increased dependence on other imported resources. Another source of criticism concerns the speed of implementation. Many observers do not oppose ethanol itself. Instead, they argue that the rollout has been rushed. Countries such as Brazil developed their ethanol ecosystems over decades, gradually building vehicle compatibility, fuel infrastructure, consumer awareness, and pricing mechanisms. Critics argue that India's transition has occurred much more rapidly, leaving consumers, manufacturers, and service providers struggling to adapt. The issue, according to these critics, is not necessarily the technology, but the manner in which it has been implemented. The controversy intensified when public debate erupted over remarks made during legal proceedings concerning the ethanol program. Critics seized upon references to the program as an experiment, arguing that citizens were being used as participants in a large-scale policy trial. Government officials later clarified their remarks and defended their policy. But the incident reinforced existing public skepticism. Ultimately, the debate over ethanol is not simply about fuel, it's about competing visions of development. One vision sees ethanol as a pathway toward energy independence and rural prosperity. Others sees it as a policy that may increase water stress, distort agricultural priorities, reduce vehicle efficiency, and impose hidden costs on consumers. The truth may ultimately lie somewhere between these lines. What is clear is that the ethanol debate is far from settled. Millions of Indians now use E20 fuel. Farmers, consumers, environmentalists, economists, and policymakers all have stake in the outcome. Whether the ethanol program will be remembered as a visionary transformation or a costly mistake remains uncertain. So, what do you guys think? Thanks for watching.